Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Hi, I'm Roberto Mazza, and this is Jerusalem Unplugged, your getaway into the multi-layered narratives of this iconic city. Each episode, I'll guide you through Jerusalem's mesmerizing chronicles and present-day realities. With leading experts as guests, we'll examine the city's intricate past, raging socio-political debates and nuances of its cosmopolitan culture. Let this podcast be your immersive audio expedition, allowing you to experience the spiritual resonance, political tensions, and dynamic voices that define Jerusalem's powerful mystique. Join me on this thought-provoking journey into one of the world's most fascinating places that has captivated everyone for centuries. On today's episode of Jerusalem Unplugged, we are honored to be joined by the esteemed Professor Arie Dubnov. Arie is Associate Professor of History at the Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And Arie is here for a special two-part exploration of Zionism. In our first installment, we'll delve deep into the origins and development of Zionism's, a plural form which is very important throughout the whole episode, from its early beginnings, through the tumultuous events leading up to the establishment of Israel in 1948 and the Nakba. Arie's profound insights will shed light on the complex ideological currents, key figures, and pivotal moments that shaped the Zionist movement during this formative period. Then, in part 2, we'll pick up the thread post-1948, post-Nakba, tracing how Zionist thought and praxis have transformed and manifested in different forms over the past 7 decades, bringing us to confront the multifaceted realities of the present day. But first things first, Arie, welcome.
Thank you, Roberto. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a great fan of your podcast, so it's an honor.
Thank you. And actually, I'm very happy that today we can talk about a topic I never really delved into, which is Zionism. And the first question I want to ask is about the complexity of understanding Zionism. Can you talk about, how can we understand this very complex movement?
Right. Well, thank you. And of course, speaking about Zionism today, of course, evokes very strong feelings and opinions, and for good reasons. And part of the task for, I think a new generation of historians, me being part of a group, definitely not doing it by myself, is also the challenge of writing new history against some sort of a textbook versions of Zionism that are very common, that assume that Zionism is a fixed set of ideas. I mean, think about even titles of classic textbook that run along lines such as the Zionist idea or the Zionist revolution. And they assume that Zionism, a bit like a church, has a dogma, has a fixed set of principles, or doxa, if you'd like. If one agrees on these principles, that's it. You're part of the club. If you resist it, you're an anti-Zionist. The Zionism is equated with only a nation status kind of understanding of what it means to be a Jewish national group. And so much of the literature and the history in the last few years is problematizing it, is showing nuance. And the new historiography kind of in a way, perhaps the nice way to present it is through a joke, right? And Zionism is a form of Jewish nationalism, and I'm always joking with my students that, you put two Jews in the room, you already have at least 4 opinions. So why should we assume that the history of Zionism is any different? And any scholar of Zionism whether he's from an old school or a new school, would agree that the chronicles of the movement is one debate after the other, quarrels about the definition of Zionism itself, divisions between political and cultural Zionism, even questions about whether Zionism is about Zion, meaning a different name for Jerusalem, and one cannot imagine Zionism outside Palestine, Israel today, or Zionism can be imagined as a place of refuge elsewhere. Even Herzl himself would think about Argentina. So in a way, some of the new literature is trying to do exactly this and think about Zionism through some sort of maybe a metaphor of family resemblance. The idea is that there's a set of ideas, and we don't need to think about one core principle or set of essential properties that all of them subscribe to. But at the same time, there is something that allows us to put them under one rubric, because there is some sort of generality and similarity between the different members and the different branches of that extended family.
And one thing that is clear from the very beginning is that we are not talking about one form of Zionism, which is the prevailing view today, but actually there are different forms of Zionism. So it's probably better to say Zionisms in plural. And I was wondering if you can tell us something about the forerunners of Zionism. So all of those movements that led to the creation of the various forms of Zionism that we're going to unpack later.
Right, absolutely. So one of the questions is, of course, how we approach the history of Zionism. And if we took the lens of the history of nationalism and nationalism studies, and we look at Zionism through that perspective as a movement of Jewish nationalism that emerges predominantly on a European soil, and looking at other nationalist movements, drawing inspiration from them, learning from them, or distancing itself from them, this is part of the dialectic. Zionism is a late runner. It's a latecomer to that story. So if you want to be very pedantic, one can say Zionism has a very clear date of birth. If you think about when the term Zionism appeared, we have exactly the date, 1897. It's the same year that Herzl had summons the first Zionist Congress, but to be actually very pedantic and accurate, it comes already from the writings of a person named Natan Birenboim, another Viennese Jew that started his career similar to Theodor Herzl, but actually later on moved to the Orthodox party, Agudat Israel. But actually, historians, and perhaps the most important in that respect is Katz, who is a sociologist historian, started coining terms like forerunners of Zionism or precursors of Zionism, and they tried to identify thinkers that already operated in the second half of the 19th century that started thinking about Jews as a national group, and or thinking about some form of return, mass immigration of Jews to Palestine in order to create some sort of an entity. And the classic names that are mentioned in that respect are, on the one hand, a very secular socialist thinker by the name of Moses Hess, a German Jew that published a book called Rome and Jerusalem, actually published it in German, so it's Rome and Jerusalem, in the 1860s. And as the title already alludes to it or hints, he draws inspiration from the Italian nationalist movement, from the Risorgimento, and he's looking at the unification of Italy, thinking about Mazzini, thinking about Garibaldi, and says, yes, the Jews need to follow that track. Moses Hess is a fascinating figure because he's also a very important figure in the history of German socialism and communism, and that's part of a longer story. We won't be able to go into it. But other names that are mentioned in that respect are of rabbis, such as Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai or Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer. Now, I won't go into detail about their thinking, about their writings. I will mention their location. Yehuda Alkalai is living in Sarajevo. Then it's still, of course, part of the Ottoman Empire. And I think that this location is very important, not less than his ideas that he expresses in a tract called The Third Redemption. because being on that part of the Ottoman Empire, he can travel into Palestine, right? So he's not crossing borders, it's part of that same empire. But at the same time, he's also seeing the first frictions and nationalist struggles in the Ottoman Empire. He sees the Greek War of Independence, and he sees the Ottoman backlash from a very close distance. So this, alongside a theological movement, is starting to rethink the term redemption, calling for Jews to return to Palestine, is part of it. The other person I've mentioned, Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, also a rabbi, but in a completely different context. He's living in Poznan and close to and today's Warsaw. He's writing a pamphlet called Drishat Zion. But again, look at the fact that I'm highlighting his location, geographical location. Those of us who know European history at that time, Poznan is where the meeting point. It's the intersection of two very strong, robust nationalist movement. He sees Polish nationalism struggling against the German nationalism. So in a way, one can say that already in these kind of forerunners of Zionism, you can see this interesting mix of drawing inspiration from European nationalist movements, but at the same time, slightly also the Jews distancing themselves from it. This side, I am slightly always cautious using terms such as forerunners or precursors from methodological reasons. It includes the fact that intellectual historians sometimes fear that we won't read too much into the writings of these figures from the 1840s and 60s and already assume that we see in them the nucleus or the origins of what will happen later on. And then we end up reading them very anachronistically and divorcing them from the context. But that's kind of a fine-tuning.
I want to ask about the crystallization process of Zionism, because obviously we have different ideas in different locations, but we also know that historically Zionism then was shaped by the ideas of a few scholars, and it became known mostly through the lenses of individual like Herzl, for instance. So can you speak about how Zionism, in plural still, eventually crystallized in the few forms that we are familiar with?
Right. Now, that's an excellent question. And perhaps the first division or tension that is an intra-Zionist tension can be put under the rubrics of cultural Zionism versus political Zionism. And what do I mean by that? So let's go to what I referred to earlier as these textbook or standard definitions of Zionism. Most of us, when we think about it, we're thinking about what is so-called political Zionism, and we associate it with the name and the idea of Theodor Herzl, the famous Viennese Jew with the famous hipster beard that was a playwright and a lawyer, was in early life was highly influenced by German nationalism, but very quickly saw that a new type of rabid anti-Semitism prevents him from assimilating and entering into German circles, and he comes with the idea already in 1896 of the Judenstaat, right, of a state for the Jews or Jewish state. And the political Zionism that is ascribed to him is very important because, of course, he's already thinking about some sort of a program. He's thinking about the way in which Zionism will create some form of a state. Later on, we can talk about the question whether he's thinking about a nation state as we imagine it and see it today, or a state with a lower s, and that's part of finer tweaks that we can do later on. And it's very important for him that the creation of this Jewish political entity would not be done in secrecy. It's not what Arthur Kessler would later call thieves in the night. It's not land grab, but it will be with the permission and the blessing of superpowers. So, of course, so much of Herzl's Herzl's attempts during his lifetime is to gain permission from the Ottoman Sultan, gain permission from even the German Kaiser. And in a way, he's even talking about some sort of a charter. So sometimes people, when they're thinking about Theodor Herzl and his diplomacy and political Zionism, they're saying it's charterism, that the Jews will gain a charter to create these Jewish colonies in the Eastern Mediterranean. And Herzl, for a long time, thinks that his target would be Western powers and also the Jews of Western Europe and Central Europe. And is, of course, very early on, needs to acknowledge the fact that the great majority of European Jews at the same time are not Central European and West European Jews, not what we call in Yiddish and in German Westjuden, but Ostjuden, Eastern Jews. And a lot of the pushback that he receives from early on comes from Russian Jews, and by the term Russian Jews, of course, I need to put it in quotation marks. I mean Jews that lived in what was then the Russian Empire. These are territories that today would be also considered Ukraine and Belarus and so on. So these are the western ends of the Russian Empire. Predominantly people such as the sages of Odessa, most predominantly Ahad Ha'am, which is a pen name of a very famous essayist and an author by the name of Asher Ginsburg. And these are people that already in the 80s were starting to talk about some sort of a Jewish communal entity. They were thinking about Jews as a national group, divorcing themselves from a religiosity. Often, many of these East European Jews had this kind of a transition, one can even say almost an Oedipal tension of growing up in very observant households and then shaking off religious conviction, but still thinking about a Jewish collective identity and thinking about how to think about Jewishness as a national group influenced by thinkers like Ernst Renan and others. And Ahad Ha'am and his followers were the first ones to start pushing back against Herzl from day one, saying, we understand when you're talking about the Jewish state, what do you mean by state? Because you're obsessed with these kind of Central European, even German conceptions of a state, and you want to copy-paste them into the Middle East. But what exactly is Jewish about this? And what is exactly the type of renaissance of Jewish creativity thought that you imagine? So although for many of those cultural Zionists, Zionism was a different thing. It was a project about Jewish renaissance and revival of writing. It's not a coincidence that so many of these Russian Jews were devoted to writing in Hebrew, writing the essays in Hebrew. Ahad Ha'am to this day is considered some sort of a landmark in essayistic writing in Hebrew. So the medium is the forum, is the message, excuse me, for them as well. And sometimes in a way to illustrate it, maybe in a kind of a reductive way, but in a way that encapsulates it, is that if we think that for Theodor Herzl and political Zionists, the goal, the aim of Zionism is to establish a state, to have a declaration of independence of the kind we saw in May 1948. Perhaps if there is an institution or establishment that symbolizes the Ahad Ha'amian approach to Zionism, that would be the Hebrew University. Why do I say Hebrew University? Because it's a modern, Western institution of higher learning, but at the same time, Jewish studies stands at the heart, at the core of it. But it's not a yeshiva, it's not a religious school. It's about how to think about modernizing Jewish learning and thought and identity in these modern traditions and so on. So if you'd like, if I'm an Ahad Ha'amian, I already established my mission was accomplished when in 1925, when the Hebrew University was established.
Now, you anticipated a question I wanted to ask about Ahad Ha'am. So I want to keep talking about Theodor Herzl because, in general, the larger public certainly is aware of a famous book, the Judenstaat, the Jewish state, but perhaps the general public doesn't know much about what I believe actually is a very important book in understanding Herzl and Zionism, which is, well, in English, it would be The All New Land, Alt Neuland. Right. Which is a novel And it's a fascinating novel because you find very interesting points, like, for instance, the idea of a Jewish society speaking Hebrew, which, and obviously we have in the State of Israel. Herzl talks about Haifa as a major commercial and financial hub for this new state, but also he talks about the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple, which obviously is very problematic in political terms. And we see today political parties that are aiming at rebuilding the temple. So I was wondering if you can actually talk a little bit more about this book and what it's about, and also the influence on Zionism of Alt-Neuland.
I love this question because I think you put your finger on an extremely important and also interesting part, right? So we think about Herzl, we think about this Judenstaat, which is actually, if anyone nowadays, we all read everything on PDFs, but if you look at the book, it's actually a pamphlet, it's a booklet, it's tiny. While the really kind of the project that Herzl was invested in for years, and that was really the apple of his eye sort of for many years, and Derek Pensler, in his beautiful biography of Herzl, writes about it very beautifully, is really this utopian novel that he called in German Alt-Neuland, that we called Old New Land, and actually in Hebrew is translated as Tel Aviv. So the name of the city, Tel Aviv, is actually there. And why do I mention the Hebrew translation? Not only because of this anecdote, because Herzl is a modernist. Sometimes when I really recommend reading this book, one of the main protagonists, the real heroes in his book, is not only the individuals, it's not only the characters, it's technology. It's about a conceptualization and justification of Zionism as that movement that will bring into late Ottoman areas new technology and new know-how, and also social democratic ideals and ideas. He's one of the villains of the book is actually a rabbi, right? That he's kind of a cleric that symbolizes, in the eyes of Herzl, kind of the old regime, is one of the baddies, the bad guys in the novel that loses. Again, I don't want to be a spoiler for those of you who want to read it. And there is also a very problematic, if you'd like, element in the book, especially for Palestinian readers, or something that we can definitely say this is Herzl in his wishful thinking. The character of Rashid Bey. He imagines a local Palestinian noble, of course he calls him an Arab noble, that not only does not oppose Zionism, but embraces it. He loves the idea that suddenly the Jews are coming and bringing these modern ideas and egalitarian ideas that are helping to improve the area both financially and technologically and politically. So it's funny to mention in that respect that in Herzl's only visit to Palestine, famously, was not, we are in a podcast that is called Jerusalem, that is dedicated to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was not the heart, it was, as we know, was kind of also the symbol of some sort of an old and dangerous source of too many theological aspirations. So for him, as a modernist European, maybe it is very symbolic that not Jerusalem is carrying the name of Herzl, but the new city on the Mediterranean that wants to see itself as very secular and almost mirror image of Jerusalem, which is Tel Aviv.
Let me ask a question I wanted to keep for the end, and we'll talk about it again. This is a utopian novel, but if you read it, you kind of see that that utopian idea became almost a reality. And I was wondering, how people relate, particularly those that are involved in Zionism and studying and understanding, but also those that feel like Zionist ideologically speaking, if there's any relationship to that utopian society that to me now looks more like a prophecy and the reality.
No, yeah, I mean, in a way, this is a question that allows us to do this meteoric shift from the 1904, 1903, or when the novel was published to contemporary events. And you won't be surprised to hear that today in Israeli discourse, and Israel is a highly polarized society, and the divides between religious and secular, and between so democratic forces and those who are saying democracy has no room here and it's actually an alien to the region and to the country, and also internal Jewish divisions between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jews. The name of Herzl and his novel are evoked time and again, and so you won't be surprised to hear that a lot of thinkers that perhaps, for the lack of a better word, today we would consider liberal Zionists are saying, let's go back to this Herzl, and I will subscribe to it. You think about the late Shlomo Avineri, think about Yuli Tamir, who is a liberal nationalist philosopher and political philosopher, and others. And in a way, they almost return to this book to say, yes, that villain, those clerical very elements that Herzl hoped would be remnants of the past, somehow they're winning. But there's also a hopeful place that it's still a process in that respect. So you are very right to suggest, if that was what you're intended to do, that even more than his political speeches and pamphlets, this utopian novel, the fiction, is part of the bloodstream and part of the debate today, much more than anything else.
Yeah, that was my feeling again, an understanding of this novel. Something that is not necessarily well known as the Judenstaat, and yet it speaks more about how Israel developed and current events in a sense. That's why I moved from this idea of a utopian writing to a prophetic one, obviously, with the insight of reading, backwards, but still, I found it fascinating. I want to stick to history and I want to ask about the first Aliyah, what we may call practical Zionism, and particularly the relationship of this form of Zionism with the local Palestinian population.
Right, absolutely. So, of course, part of what we have to remember when we're going back to the early years of Zionism is also, especially when we start transitioning from where the ideas originated, which is a European setting, we're moving into the Mediterranean and into the Middle East. How in practice it was operated, we have to remember that we're still part of the late Ottoman period, right? It's also important to understand Herzl because so much of his policies and ideas are based on the premise that the late Ottoman Empire wants to reform itself and want to modernize, and this is why they will be actually looking with a favorable eye at these Jewish colonists. But in the first years that you see first immigrants coming to Palestine and starting to establish colonies, and yes, they were calling it colonies, and nowadays people are so fearful about talking about using the C word, colonization. It's for me as a historian quite odd because the documents are full of references to creations of type of colonies. So the first wave that we sometimes call the first Aliyah, from the 1890s to roughly 1904, part of what you see is attempt to build these first farms and colonies. And a lot of what they are thinking about, and a lot of what the first Zionists are thinking about, is even about specific know-how. So there's a lot of importance that is given to scientific experts, German scientific expertise and know-how. I'm thinking about figures like David Wolfson, who was the second president of the World Zionist Congress after Herzl died, Otto Warburg from the famous Warburg family, and others others. These are people that were very well versed in the German colonial experience. They were even thinking about the very practicalities. They were thinking about the best plants that one could plant and grow so that these colonies will be self-sufficient economically, and it can and even provide surplus and to sell their products. It was also aided by philanthropy. So the British branch of the Rothschild, Edmund Rothschild, is creating a system in these colonies, what was called then the Pica colonies, with even like clerks that try to think about how to manage them, and again saying what would be the best way the products of that they need to grow. So for instance, the Yekev, the winery in Rishon LeZion, is part of it. The idea that you will grow, you'll produce wine there. So in a way, a lot of those big cultural and ideological debates between political Zionism and cultural Zionism that are extremely important for the intellectual and the thinkers, in a way, are pushed aside to these practical questions about how to make these tiny first colonies. And the first Aliyah really establishes only 7 colonies, and even they are shaky and not really working, are there the main sources of debate and quandary. Part of it is what is very interesting about these first colonies is also that living in Palestine, living in late Ottoman Palestine, they automatically, of course, encounter the indigenous population, Palestinians, Cherkessi, Bedouins. And surprising as it may sound to a contemporary ear, among many of them, you will find something that I would call some sort of an enchantment from the East, and even Arabization, right? If someone looks at the members of Hashomer, the Guard, it was a group of Jews that decided they need to learn how to secure their own farms by themselves. They are wearing Arab garment. They imitate the locals in their dress and the way they asked photographers to take their photos on a horseback with a rifle. So you will see East European, Russian, Romanian Jews dressed like local Arabs. And of course, for us today, it would look like a form of a very, very crude cultural appropriation. But it is part of that kind of a early phase that those colonists are saying, if we're moving to that part of what was then called the Orient, we need to undergo a process of Arabization or Orientalization. Even was a famous author by the name of Moshe Smilansky that was writing letters and short stories under the pen name Hawaja Musa. So again, sort of me, the Jew, reconnecting with my Eastern roots and Semitic roots, and are part of it. And which is, of course, something that changed radically later on in processes that me and others also calling it moving from disenchantment to disenchantment, that the Jew starts looking at themselves as separated from the Arabs and looking down at them. But while saying all of this, I don't want to overstate my claim. And of course, there were already first frictions and first tensions that were emerging in that period. So already in the first Aliyah and in response to these first colonies, you will start seeing neighborly disputes and also internal criticisms emerging from within the Zionist circles about the way these colonists are looking at their Arab neighbors. Echad Ha'am that we mentioned earlier would be one of the first ones to pen a series of articles under the title Emet Me'eretz Israel, Truth from Eretz Israel. It was written following his first visit to Palestine in February and May 1891, and was published in Russia, but in Hebrew, in a journal called Hamelit. And he was already criticizing the attitude of those first European colonists that are looking at the locals as desert savages, like donkeys, and he was warning already from the early stage, famously, that the basic principle on which this entire project would rest is not the quantity of the immigrants, but the quality of those actions. And it was followed very few years later on with a very famous speech by Yitzhak Epstein, who was a teacher, an educator, very much invested again in Hebrew teaching and learning, who delivered a speech that later turned into, again, an article under the title "The Hidden Question." And the title already hints to where it goes. If Zionism thinks about itself as the solution to the Jewish question, the Judenfrage, he's already warning in 1905, 1907 that it might, there's another new question that is arising, which is the attitude towards the local population. And he makes this connection very clear. In a way, today, to use to contemporary parlance, he was already warning in 1907 that there is an elephant in the room. You cannot, ignore the Palestinian question by only focusing on the Jewish question. And he was saying it because he saw in himself that sometimes the practices of land purchases that were completely legal involved, asking the local falachin, the peasants who were living on the land, that often were illiterate and so on, they became homeless. And he saw it in the case of Metula, and that was part of what prompted him to write this famous essay.
And yet I was thinking about the recent work of Yair Wallach that is kind of like rethinking about Ashkenazi Jewish identity into Arab societies. And basically his argument is that, well, we need to look at how there was an attempt for Ashkenazi Jews to integrate into Arab society. Now, today it really looks like far-fetched to think about it, but it looks like there was an historical space, a moment where this dynamic could actually, become the norm, but it didn't.
I think you're absolutely right. And of course, Wallach is doing a fascinating and extremely important work in that respect, working against contemporary biases and prejudices that are both, not only prejudice that are colored by the contemporary very, very violent events and the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, but even internal Israeli and Jewish conflicts between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi that tend to essentialize and look at, all European Jews as cut from the same cloth, and as if they're incapable of integrating into the late Ottoman space. And it works both on the level of culture and identity, but it even has a political dimension, especially after 1908 and the Young Turk Revolution. So, for instance, one of the fascinating examples is the case of Itamar Ben-Avi. Itamar Ben-Avi was a Jewish journalist, if you'd like, even a yellow tabloid type of newspapers was where he was feeling most comfortable with. He's the son of Eliezer Ben Yehuda, the famous lexicographer that sometimes people describe as the person that revived Hebrew language. It is, of course, a very inaccurate description, but for the sake of the argument, we leave it as is. And Itamar Ben-Avi and his father, Eliezer Ben Yehuda, when the Young Turk Revolution took place, they were calling upon their Jewish counterparts to divorce themselves from their European passports, right? So to renounce your Russian and European citizenship and become Ottoman citizens and join the new type of order that is there. And they even on their newspapers had this kind of every day on the front page, underneath the title name of the newspaper, will have call Yehudim, hitatmenu, like calling imperative on Jews, become Ottoman, Ottomanize yourself, and so on and so forth. So it's really important to remind our listeners that we are still living in a pre-World War I era. It's a place of multinational empires, and many of these Jews, when they're thinking about a brighter horizon and a future, they are not imagining these multinational empires collapsing and disappearing, as would be the case in World War I, but are still thinking about some sort of a way in which Jews will find themselves a place within these multinational empires. And it both and works in the Russian Empire when they're thinking about some sort of territorial existence of the Jews as some sort of an autonomy within that space, and of course also in the late Ottoman Empire. So it's very hard for us today to reconnect with this pre-World War I multinational imperial imagination that was for them bread and butter. That was kind of a like fish swimming in the sea. That was kind of the water in which they were swimming. They were not thinking nation states in the way that we assume is the normal way that nationalists are thinking.
I think you made a very good point, reminding the listeners that in that context, people couldn't have seen and foreseen the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and of the Ottoman polity. So it's important to remember that, we read history backwards with the insight of what happened next, but they didn't know what was going to happen. And I think this is very important. For them, the Ottoman Empire was the reality, and no one could have predicted that it would just simply collapse with the outbreak of World War I.
Yeah, and I would just plug in very briefly even the articles and writings of Dmitry Shumsky, who's is a professor at the Hebrew University, that even has a very interesting, if you'd like, revisionist reading of even Leon Pinsker, one of the founding fathers of Russian Zionism, and he says we need to understand, reread his famous pamphlets about auto-emancipation and so on through that perspective, re-understanding that this is part of that long lost galaxy of multinational empires.
And I want to move to talk about religious Zionism. So if you can talk a little bit more about the concept, but more importantly, if you can tell us about the figure of Rabbi Kook.
Yeah, fantastic. So yes, so after we talked about political Zionism and cultural Zionism, we definitely will have to bring into the picture religious Zionism and labor Zionism. So let's start with religious Zionism, which is perhaps the most complicated one to talk about, because actually from a religious point of view, these are actually not such natural partners as we might imagine them. And definitely it's very surprising given the state of Zionism today, where religious Zionism and settler religious Zionism is the most dominant form of Zionism there. And why is that the case? So I would recommend the listeners to this podcast to maybe pick up the studies of Eliezer Levitsky, who's and other scholars of Jewish theology, that will show us very clearly that for many years, many of the established theological thinkers and the rabbis were very fearsome of any type of kind of a modern secular attempt to bring back the Jews to their home. Now, this is not because, of course, every religious Jew prays 3 times a day about the return to Zion, to Jerusalem. But this is a divine plan, and humans are not supposed to do active things in this world to intervene and to bring about the end. This is what in Jewish theology is called the Drikat HaKetz. Bring the end with a capital E is not something that humans are doing. And there's always the fear that perhaps Herzl and his counterparts are, reincarnations of a false messiah. Here's another subtype V that is coming. This is very important to understand it because you then understand the drama behind the first rabbis that are trying to do a very complicated intellectual acrobatics that would allow them to look at these first Zionist settlers and think about that maybe they are vehicles that might bring about the Messiah. And Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Kook, who moved to Palestine to become a rabbi in Jaffa in 1904, would be a very key figure in that respect. The first signs of his move in that direction perhaps can be dated really to July 1904, when he delivers an obituary in the memory of Theodor Herzl. It's famously known as the Lamentation in Jerusalem, and where he starts thinking about Herzl, knowing that Herzl is not an observant Jew, and so on, as perhaps starting a project that is the birth pang of Messiah. And starting to introduce the idea of Mashiach ben Yosef, Messiah of son of Joseph, that is kind of in Jewish prophecy will be one minor Messiah and leading to the road of the older Messiah. And his followers and Rabbi Kook itself will start developing a very interesting attitude towards even the next wave of Zionist immigrants, what we sometimes call as the second Aliyah and the third Aliyah, that many of them, especially the core ideologues and the most vocal component in the labor Zionists in the second Aliyah, were not only non-religious, but often they were anti-religious, they were anti-clerical, they were highly influenced by Russian socialist and Marxist ideas. They looked at religion as the opiate of the masses. In some cases, they looked down at the clerical establishment in Eastern Europe and wanted to distance themselves. They definitely didn't keep Sabbath or kashrut, dietary rules. And nevertheless, Rabbi Kook would start looking at these pioneers as vehicles that might bring about the Messiah. So you'll have a very interesting sort of, if you'd like, love-hate relationship between these socialist Zionists and religious Zionists that pre-exist, that goes all the way back to the beginning of Zionism. But I would suggest that until much later stage, and only after the establishment of Israel, only then would religious Zionism would really move from the margins or the shadows to the front stage. They were not so much calling the shots throughout the late Ottoman and the mandatory period.
I will ask later about this sort of reemergence of religion in Israel, but I want to talk about the sort of a period of World War I and obviously the Mandate era, because this is where we have the famous Balfour Declaration, which was issued by the British, supporting a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And I was wondering if you can talk about how Zionism changed throughout the Mandate era, but also perhaps to explore to whom the Balfour Declaration was addressed, essentially to which kind of Zionism and Zionist.
Absolutely. Yes, of course. And one cannot understate the importance of World War I and the way in which the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the conquest of Palestine by Britain really is a landmark. It's not simply a landmark event. It really changes the rules of the game, and it's a completely different set of political realities and circumstances. And the way in which the Zionists need to play their cards vis-a-vis Central Power after World War I is radically different. And perhaps, as you mentioned, the Balfour Declaration and the person whose name is best associated with it, Dr. Chaim Weizmann, should be mentioned at that respect. So, few very quick words about Dr. Chaim Weizmann. Weizmann is a Russian Jew. He actually started his first steps as one of the followers of Ahad Ha'am. He was one of as a young man that was pushing against Herzl in the First Zionist Congress, part of that group that called itself the Democratic Fraction. They were arguing against Herzl that you are a German-speaking Jew, that you are removed from the masses that are the East European Jews, and you're actually ruling your organization in a not really democratic ways, and we are democratic. And he immigrates to, he's a scientist, he's a chemist by training, and from a long through a long and convoluted career, he finds himself in Britain, in Manchester, naturalized as a British citizen, and he becomes a very kind of a patriotic Anglo-Jew that is very happy to support the English war effort during World War One. And part of this is important because often you will see that in narratives that try to explain why did the British issue the Balfour Declaration, they will present it as almost a trophy or something that they almost gave Chaim Weizmann as a thanking him for his contribution to the war effort. What was his contribution? As a biochemist, he developed organisms that allowed to accelerate the production of
Acetone.
so. So what is the Balfour Declaration? The Balfour Declaration is actually, the name declaration is a bit of a misnomer because technically it's a letter, and it's a very short letter. It's only 129 words, but so much ink was spilled about it. And it's not even a letter that is sent to Chaim Weizmann itself. It's sent from Lord Arthur Balfour in the Foreign Office to Lord Rothschild, that was kind of representing British Jewry at the time. And it's a very carefully crafted document that every word was measured very carefully in it, and we have numerous drafts of the letter that in which the British are saying that His Majesty's government will look with favor at the establishment in Palestine of a national home to the Jewish people. Now, why do I focus on the exact phrasing? If I'm a political scientist or an international relations professor, I'm familiar with political entities that are called states, republics. Definitely in the world of empires, I'm familiar with entities that are called colonies. I can even, if I'm a British imperialist, I can think about entities that are called dominions and so on. But this thing, national home, is a bit of a neologism. It's a new word that is invented to say something that is, on the one hand, is a promise, saying, yes, we see the Zionist efforts and we support them, we're sympathetic, but without promising something concrete. It's not promising the Jews that will have a state or a sovereignty or a nation state and so on. It's not even establishment of a national home in all of Palestine. It's in Palestine, so it's even geographical dimensions are completely unclear. So who knows? Maybe the British could have said, you see, look at these new neighborhoods north of Jaffa that the Jews are calling Tel Aviv. Let's call this the national home, and that's it. Mission accomplished. We fulfilled our promise. Now, I'm making these statements to just not to belittle the importance of the Balfour Declaration, but actually to do the opposite, to show that what will happen from November 2nd, 1917 onwards is that the Zionists, under the leadership of Chaim Weizmann, will turn this very kind of a carefully crafted letter into something, a document that will gain political power and muscle and meaning throughout this for the next 3 decades. And by 1922, when you have a new international order and there's a new entity called the League of Nations and a new type of regime that says these empires that did win World War I have mandated territories, and there's a Palestine mandate that is given a green light from the League of Nations, the Balfour Declaration would stand at its heart. It's 5 years later, 1922. And this is when later on the Balfour Declaration would be alluded to even in the Israeli Declaration of Independence, right? And why is that important? Remember when I talked about Herzl, I said that many times people are reducing his ideas to charterism. And I also alluded to the fact that Herzl tried to gain some sort of a charter, recognition for world powers and international orders for it, and he failed to do that. So think about the irony that Chaim Weizmann, that starts his career, is actually one of the members of the biting opposition against Herzl, is actually the one that succeeds in achieving what Herzl failed to do. And this is why after World War I, Chaim Weizmann, and especially the fact that his real headquarters is in Great Russell Street in London, at the very heart of London, and he has access to the quarters of power in the Colonial Office, the Foreign Office, and even 10 Downing Street, is in a way a far more important figure, and he succeeds where Herzl failed. And given the fact that he has, his heart in cultural Zionism, but he's a political Zionist at the same time, and he's also a chemist, it's not surprising that the type of Zionism that he professes is often referred to as synthetic Zionism, right? Let's bring the political and the cultural together and work with this new sheriff in town called the British Empire. And this is our way to advance our goal.
And that wraps up part one of our in-depth exploration into the origins and development of Zionism with Professor Arie Dubnov. And with his guidance, this first episode has provided certainly a thought-provoking journey through the layered histories of one of the most influential nationalist ideologies of the modern era. But our comprehensive look is far from over. In the next installment, we'll pick up from the late Mandate period and we'll start talking about paramilitary organizations, and then Professor Dubnov will trace how Zionist thoughts and praxis transformed over the following decades post-1948, post-Nakba, analyzing its ongoing impact up to the present day. So be sure to follow us. You won't miss part two of this fascinating dive into the complex evolution of Zionisms. And until next time, thank you for listening to Jerusalem Unplugged.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.